Their foramen magnum, as you can see here, is at the back of the skull. So that is a genetic trait.
In the Peruvian desert, archaeologists found skulls that did not look human, ancient, enormous. The heads stretched far backward into a long, hollow cone, heavy and misshapen in a way that was deeply unsettling. And beside them, wrapped in the same burial cloth, were children, infants, bundled together with the dead in a darkness undisturbed for 3,000 years. Science looked at all of it and gave the world an answer. The world believed it. The answer was wrong. For nearly a century, the real truth stayed hidden inside those bones, locked in DNA, too shattered for any human to read. Then, AI changed everything. It tore through that ancient genetic code and found something so unexpected, so deeply unsettling that the scientists who saw the results went very quiet.
You're seeing concrete, tangible, DNA testable proof that extraterrestrials walked on Earth right among us.
The discovery. In 1927, a Peruvian archaeologist named Julio Tello walked into one of the driest, most lifeless stretches of coastline on Earth, the Paracas Peninsula, a place where the desert runs all the way to the Pacific Ocean and almost nothing survives. No rain, no vegetation, just sand, rock, and silence. Tello was not an ordinary archaeologist. He was the finest Peru had ever produced. He had spent decades studying the ancient cultures of his country. He had heard stories from local people about strange burial sites hidden somewhere beneath that barren ground. He believed them enough to mount a serious expedition. His team included trained excavators, field archaeologists, and local specialists. They arrived with ground mapping tools, preservation materials, and everything needed to document and protect whatever lay beneath the sand. This was not a casual dig. This was a full, carefully organized scientific mission. Tello was convinced something important was down there. He was right. He just had no idea what it would cost him to find it. What he found shattered everything he thought he knew. His team broke through into a series of underground tombs cut nearly 25 feet into solid rock, not dug into soft earth, cut into rock, with clean walls and precise angles. Inside, they found dozens of tightly wrapped mummy bundles, each one seated upright in a basket, not laid down, seated, positioned, as if whoever placed them there believed they were still present in some way. But that was only the beginning. Not far away, they uncovered something far larger, a massive underground burial complex containing over 400 mummy bundles. This place is now called the Paracas Necropolis, which simply means City of the Dead. These were not ordinary burials. These were the remains of an elite class of people, wrapped in some of the most extraordinary textiles ever found anywhere in the ancient world. The fabrics were woven from fine cotton and alpaca wool. They were embroidered with over 190 distinct color shades, still vivid after 3,000 years in the dark. The designs showed shamans, mythical creatures, and complex geometric patterns. The skill required to produce these textiles was extraordinary. This was not the work of a primitive culture. This was a civilization with wealth, organization, and a very sophisticated visual language. Then Tello's team began unwrapping the bundles, and underneath all that beauty, they found the skulls. The moment those skulls were uncovered, the mood at the excavation site changed. These were not normal human heads. They were massive, stretched far backward into a long, narrow, cone-like shape. Nothing in Tello's training had prepared him for what he was looking at. But the skulls were not the only disturbing thing. When the team began unwrapping the mummy bundles, some of them contained more than one body. Adults were found wrapped together with children. Several of the bodies showed clear signs of violent death. These were not people who had simply passed away and been buried. Some of them had been killed. What made it stranger was the timeline. The burial site had not been used once and abandoned. Bodies had been added to it over hundreds of years, placed in a careful, organized sequence across many generations. Someone kept coming back. Someone kept maintaining this place long after the people who originally built it were dead. It ran like an institution, controlled, deliberate, ongoing. Then there was something hidden in plain sight on the textiles themselves. The embroidered figures woven into those burial fabrics, the gods and supernatural beings the Paracas people considered divine, all had elongated heads, not as a decorative choice, not as a symbol of status. They were depicted that way as a natural feature, as if that was simply what those beings looked like by default. The people who made these fabrics were showing what their gods looked like, and their gods looked exactly like the skulls lying beside them. Tello spent the rest of his life trying to explain what he had found. He never could. The answers his generation was looking for would not come from a shovel. They would come nearly a century later, from technology that did not exist yet. The official explanation and why it breaks. When news of the skulls spread through the scientific community, researchers had an answer ready almost immediately. The skulls, they said, were the result of a practice called artificial cranial deformation. It sounds complex, but the idea is straightforward. If you bind a baby's head tightly with boards and cloth shortly after birth, while the skull is still soft, the growing brain will push against the bindings, and the head will slowly grow into a different shape. Applied carefully over several years, the result is a dramatically elongated skull. This was not a new discovery. The practice had appeared in multiple ancient cultures, completely independent of one another. The Mangbetu people of Central Africa did it. The Huns, a fearsome group of warriors who swept through Europe, did it. The ancient Maya of Central America did it. For all of these cultures, an elongated head was a mark of power. It separated the ruling class from everyone else in a way that was visible at a single glance. You could not fake it. You were either born into that life of binding, or you were not. So, when scientists saw the Paracas skulls, many of them closed the case immediately. Head binding, explained, move on. But the case was never as closed as they claimed. The first problem is size. Head binding changes the shape of a skull, but it cannot change its total volume. The human brain has a fixed size. The skull simply follows the brain as it grows. Binding redirects that growth. It does not add to it. Yet some of the Paracas skulls measured up to 25% larger in total internal volume than a normal human skull. That is not redirection. That is extra space. And no board or cord applied to an infant's head can create extra space where none existed. The second problem is a structure called the sagittal suture. In every normal human skull, there is a fibrous joint that runs along the top of the head, connecting two separate bone plates. It is a defining feature of our species. It is genetically programmed to be there. In many of the Paracas skulls, this suture is completely absent. The cranium appears to have grown as a single piece of bone. No external pressure applied after birth can erase a feature that forms before birth. The third problem is the one that ends the argument entirely. Some of the elongated skulls found at Paracas belong to fetuses, unborn babies, infants who died before they ever entered the world. Their skulls were already elongated in the womb. No binding device had ever touched them. No board, no cord, nothing. Their heads were that shape from the moment they formed. This was not a cultural practice. This was biology. And once that was clear, researchers had no choice but to go back to the bones, because the shape was only the beginning. What the bones actually say. Before any laboratory ever opened its doors, the bones were already telling a story, and that story was dark. Take the skull structure itself. A normal human skull is formed from two large bone plates separated by a joint called the sagittal suture. This is not a minor detail. It is one of the most basic features of human anatomy, present in every person who has ever lived. In many of the Paracas skulls, there is only one plate, one continuous piece of bone, with no joint, no division, no suture at all. That kind of skull does not form because of something done to a person after birth. It forms that way in the womb. It is built into the biology from the very beginning. Then there is the foramen magnum. This is the opening at the base of the skull where the spinal cord connects to the brain. In a normal human skull, it sits in a specific position. In the Paracas skulls, it sits further back. This changes the angle at which the head connects to the spine. It means these people did not carry their heads the way we carry ours. That is not a shape variation. That is a structural difference in how the body was built. Then there is the hair. Several of the mummies were found with reddish-brown or auburn hair. Some samples appeared even lighter. The standard explanation is that desert heat and mineral exposure bleached naturally dark hair over thousands of years. That does happen, but under microscopic analysis, some of the Paracas hair samples showed color distribution patterns that look less like bleached dark hair and more like hair that was naturally lighter to begin with. Nobody in the mainstream scientific community has been willing to examine that finding seriously. Now, look at what the textiles are saying. The burial fabrics found at Paracas were covered in embroidered figures representing supernatural beings and divine ancestors. Every single one of those figures has an elongated head, not as a ritual symbol, not as an artistic choice, as a natural feature, as the baseline appearance of a being that existed above ordinary humanity. The people who wove those textiles lived alongside the individuals buried in them. They chose those images deliberately. They were depicting what they believed those people actually looked like, or what they descended from. Consider the location of the burial site itself. The Paracas Peninsula has almost no rainfall. The temperatures swing violently between day and night. There is no agricultural value to the land. Nobody stumbles into a place like that by accident and decides to build a civilization. But it does have something rare. The night skies above the Paracas Peninsula are among the clearest on Earth. Almost no atmospheric interference. A people who navigated by stars, who crossed oceans by reading the sky, would have recognized that immediately. They did not settle there despite the harshness. They settled there because of what it allowed them to see above them every night. The bones had taken this mystery as far as human eyes could take it. Every anomaly pointed away from any known human population. What came next required something no human eye could do alone. The AI and the DNA bombshell. Ancient DNA is not easy to read. Genetic material that is 3,000 years old does not survive in one piece. Over time, it breaks apart into millions of tiny fragments, each one too small and too damaged to read on its own. For most of history, that meant the genetic secrets locked inside ancient bones stayed locked forever. Every question the skulls raised had no way of being answered. The technology simply did not exist. Then it did. Scientists developed powerful computer algorithms capable of doing something no human researcher ever could. These systems could sort through millions of broken genetic fragments simultaneously, find repeating patterns buried inside the chaos, and reconstruct the original DNA sequence from its scattered pieces. Think of it like taking a document that has been shredded into 10 million strips, scattering those strips across a football field, and then reassembling the original text perfectly. That is what this technology made possible. This is the artificial intelligence at the center of this story. Not a robot, not a thinking machine. A computational system of extraordinary power that could see what no human eye could find alone. And when it was pointed at the Paracas skulls, it did not just read the DNA. It tore the accepted story of human history apart. Before the DNA analysis even began, AI imaging tools had already been applied to the physical structure of the skulls themselves. These systems scanned bone density, plate formation, and structural measurements with a precision that decades of manual examination had never achieved. What they confirmed was disturbing. The structural anomalies in the Paracas skulls were not measurement errors. They were not exaggerations. The single bone plate where two should exist. The repositioned foramen magnum, the expanded cranial volume. The AI confirmed every one of them, objectively, without human bias, without room for dismissal. But the DNA results were where everything collapsed. The samples were collected by a researcher named Brian Furster, who had spent years trying to gain access to the Paracas remains. Hair, skin, and bone powder were taken from the most extremely elongated skulls in the collection and sent to a genetics laboratory for analysis. Everyone expected the same result. The Paracas people were assumed to be an indigenous culture that developed in isolation in Peru. Their DNA should have matched the genetic profile of known Native American groups. That result would have closed the case permanently. That is not what the AI found. The mitochondrial DNA, which is the genetic material passed down exclusively through the mother, revealed haplogroups that were completely foreign to the Americas. A haplogroup is essentially a broad genetic family group, a way of tracing which ancient population a person descended from. The haplogroups in the Paracas skulls did not match anything from the Andes, the Amazon, or anywhere else on the continent. They matched populations from the Caucasus region, the mountainous territory between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and from ancient Mesopotamia, the region of the Middle East, where the world's first cities were built and where writing was invented. One specific haplogroup, called T2b, is most densely concentrated in the ancient populations of the Fertile Crescent. These were the people who first domesticated crops, first built organized cities, and first developed the foundations of civilization itself. Their genetic fingerprint had no business being inside a skull buried on the coast of Peru. One individual in the study had DNA so completely dominated by this foreign ancestry that it contained almost no recognizable Native American markers at all. The AI analysis pointed to a direct first or second generation migrant, not a distant descendant, not a faint trace of ancient mixing, someone whose parents or whose parent and grandparent had come directly from that part of the world. The official model of how the Americas were settled states that all ancient American populations descended from people who crossed from Asia into North America roughly 15,000 years ago. There is no room in that model for a group carrying Middle Eastern DNA arriving in Peru 3,000 years ago. The journey would have required ocean navigation and shipbuilding knowledge that mainstream history insists did not exist at that time. The AI did not care about the official model. It only reported what was there. A genetically distinct group of people carrying ancestry from the ancient Middle East had arrived in Peru, risen to the top of Paracas society, and been buried as its ruling elite. The mystery of the skulls was no longer just physical, it was genetic. And the question it left behind was one that science had not prepared anyone to answer. Where did they come from? The DNA gave an answer, but the answer created a problem bigger than the question it solved. A group of people carrying genetic ancestry from the ancient Middle East arrived on the coast of Peru 3,000 years ago and became the ruling class of an advanced civilization. The science says that happened. What the science cannot explain is how. To even begin answering that, you have to consider something that mainstream history has always been uncomfortable with: the possibility that the ancient world was far more connected than we have been taught. There is a theory called diffusionism. It proposes that the great ancient civilizations did not all develop completely separately from one another. Instead, it suggests that advanced knowledge, including astronomy, architecture, and navigation, was carried across the world by contact between ancient peoples, not through gradual cultural drift, through deliberate long-distance movement of people who already knew things that others did not. The most radical version of this theory involves a lost civilization, a single advanced culture that was destroyed by a catastrophic event and whose survivors scattered across the earth, arriving in different regions and becoming the founding elite of the civilizations we now study as independent. The legend of Atlantis is the most famous version of this story. Whether Atlantis was a real place or a cultural memory of something that actually happened, the pattern it describes fits the Paracas evidence in a way that is very difficult to ignore. Think about what the Paracas elite brought with them beyond their DNA. Their textile technology had no local history. It did not develop gradually in Peru. It appeared fully formed at an extraordinarily high level with no intermediate stages in the archaeological record before it. Advanced skills do not appear from nothing. They are either built up over generations, which leaves traces, or they are imported fully developed by people who already had them. The Paracas textiles left the second kind of trace. Now, think about the head binding practice differently. If the original group already had skulls that were naturally slightly different from the local population, then the ritual of binding the heads of their children was not about creating something new. It was about preserving something they already had. It was a way of keeping their descendants visually distinct, of marking their bloodline as the heirs of people who had come from somewhere else. The binding was not invention. It was memory. Then there are the Nazca lines. Located approximately 200 kilometers from the Paracas burial sites, These enormous figures and geometric shapes were carved into the desert floor by the culture that followed the Paracas. They encode precise astronomical alignments and are only fully visible from high above the ground. If the people who made them were descended from the Paracas elite, and if the Paracas elite had navigated oceans by reading the stars to get there, then those lines are not a mystery at all. They are a record, left by people who knew exactly where they came from and wanted to make sure that knowledge survived long after they were gone. The evidence kept pointing in the same direction, but for a century, the institutions responsible for studying that evidence had done something very strange. Almost nothing. The suppression. A full peer-reviewed genetic confirmation of Middle Eastern DNA in the Paracas elite would not update a history textbook. It would destroy one. It would force mainstream science to formally accept that people crossed the ocean thousands of years before Columbus. It would validate the theory of ancient global contact. It would require a complete rethinking of how civilization developed. For institutions that have spent over a century building and defending the current historical model, that is not a finding. That is a catastrophe. And the evidence suggests they knew it. Start with what happened to the physical evidence itself. The Museo Regional de Ica in Peru held one of the most significant collections of Paracas skulls in the world. According to the museum's own records, approximately 300 of those skulls went missing, not in a single event, not through a disaster or a fire. They disappeared gradually over time, with no formal investigation, no public explanation, and no accountability. 300 pieces of irreplaceable physical evidence, gone quietly, one by one. Then look at what happened to researchers who tried to study what remained. Brian Furster spent years attempting to obtain samples from the Paracas collections for comprehensive DNA testing. His requests were ignored, delayed, and denied. The standard justification given by institutions was that the remains were too fragile for further testing. But that reasoning collapses under scrutiny. Egyptian mummies thousands of years older than the Paracas skulls have been subjected to extensive genetic analysis with full institutional support. Neanderthal bones dating back tens of thousands of years have been successfully sequenced. The fragility argument was never applied to them. It was applied here. The Peruvian government has classified many of the most unusual Paracas specimens as protected indigenous remains. These legal protections make comprehensive independent genetic testing nearly impossible. The protections exist for legitimate reasons in many contexts, but the practical effect in this case is a legal wall around the very evidence that could settle the debate permanently. Then consider the DNA data itself. The raw genetic files from the Furster study have never been deposited in any public scientific database. In modern genetics, significant findings are almost always published in open access repositories so that other scientists can verify or challenge the results. The absence of that data from any public archive means the findings cannot be independently confirmed. They exist in a space where they can be dismissed without being disproven. And here is the question that none of the institutions involved have ever answered cleanly. If the skulls are simply a case of head binding, and if the DNA would simply confirm indigenous ancestry, then a full publicly funded peer-reviewed genetic study would end the fringe theories permanently. It would be the simplest, most decisive way to close the debate. That study has not happened, not in 100 years of institutional access to these remains. Somewhere, the answer may already exist. A result that was run, recorded, and quietly filed away. Not published, not announced, not destroyed, because destroying it would draw attention, just kept out of reach. The skulls have not disappeared, but the truth about what is inside them may be sitting in a room that the people who hold the key have no intention of opening.